Good afternoon and welcome to Artefact Live with me, Scott MacArthur. How are you all? Thanks very much for tuning in. Thanks for joining me last week with Mike, where we looked at the future, if you like, and how artificial intelligence and robotics and how they are influencing the future and the stories that people are telling in the technology world. Well, on this show, we look at why or how stories impact our lives and how important they are. And this is my 60th show. So I thought, what could I do that could make it stand out? Well, I'm on my own today. I decided to do it on my own. And I wondered about a topic. And the topic that's probably closer to my heart than anything is Scotland. For those of you who don't know me, I was born in a wee town in the middle of Scotland called Lanark. And I spent the first 26 years of my life there. I've since spent the other 26 years of my life down south in England. So I've had experience of living in Scotland and in England. So I've got a perspective, I think. But there's a number of reasons why I wanted to talk about this today, and I hope you enjoy it. It's slightly different, and it celebrates Burns Day, because of those of you who don't know, our national poet, Robert Burns, is celebrated on the 25th of January every year. It's also my partner Samantha's birthday, which is quite convenient because it helps me remember. Don't let her know that I said that. But one of the things that I think is really important is that we consider stories in the context of culture. And Scottish culture is, very much in the media at the moment with the nationalist movement and the things that are happening in Scotland that are not happening in England, and the difference between the two countries, etc., etc. But I'm not going to go there. This is not about that. I want to look at the culture of Scotland through the lens of some of our greatest storytellers. And of course, that will include Robbie Burns. It would be daft not to include him today, wouldn't it? But let me try and give you a reason, though, because I think, as I've said on the show, this is my 60th show talking about storytelling, so I obviously like storytelling. But one of the things I did during lockdown with my friend Andy Muir, who lives over in Sydney, he usually tunes in. Hello, Andy. And we were sitting, and we had a sort of hobby project that we've been doing, believe it or not, for 20 years, which is about a Scottish venue called the Glasgow Apollo. And I'll just put the stinger for the show, and so you can see the sort of things that we do. And let me just swap this round. I'll just leave it like that. That's fine. And what we do on that show is we talk about this old venue and how important it was to us and to the culture of Glasgow. And I think the thing that I've learned, and I think Andy would agree with me, is that, it's been amazing. But what's happened is we've gone from, before lockdown, we had about 4,500 people as members of that group. We've now got nearly 11,000. And I think the reason for that is that there's something about the psychology of Scotland that really loves music and therefore storytelling. And I think that became clearer and clearer and clearer to me as we went through this process. And we're now at a point where we're about to help a production company make a video about the Glasgow Apollo. We're about to talk about the fans, these people you see on the screen right now, the fans' perspective, not the perspective of the bands. Now, this is quite unusual because normally in these circumstances, it comes from the famous people, if you like. But I actually think the cultural aspect of this is much, much more interesting. And we can learn a lot about ourselves, our culture, and the world through storytelling. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy today and you'll get something from it that maybe you didn't expect from this show. So just to remind you, you're watching Artefact Live, where we look at the science and the art of storytelling with me, your host, Scott MacArthur. So I wondered where to start. Well, reasonably easy. It's Burns Day. So I thought I'd have a look at the bard, Scotland's bard, and think about what he meant and why he means things, etc., etc. But just to give you a way of an introduction, I actually visited Burns's hometown of Dumfries last week with my friend Ewan. We went on a bit of a trip. We do this every 30 years, where we'll go around bits of Scotland and sometimes England, looking at the castles and the history and the stories that are in those particular parts of the world. And this time we went to Dumfries and we had a look at the Robert Burns Museum, which you can see in front of you just now, and we visited his memorial, which is just here. He was only 37 when he died. 37. That astonished me. I didn't realise he was quite as young as that. But Burns's name is pretty much globally synonymous with Scotland. He's the guy that everybody talks about, and I'm going to play one of his best known pieces. It's quite a short piece, that's deliberate for today's show, of course. But I loved visiting his home. It was much more intimate than I expected, and the bit of it that really it's on two. It's actually on 3 levels, but only two levels of the house are open to the public. And the bit that really got me was it was very small. I mean, the bed upstairs, which is just up on the right as you go up the stairs, is a tiny little thing. You know, you can see, I think that's in this picture. Is it in this picture? Yeah, that wooden box there on the right is actually the edge of the bed. It's like a box. And I reckon it was maybe 5 feet wide long. So he was a wee guy. Not only did he die young, he was a wee guy. So quite a lot of Scots are quite small right enough. But the thing that I loved about it, before I show you the poem, is on one of the windows. Now, this is a photograph I took, and it's not easy to take the photograph as it was quite a bright day. But this is Robert Burns' signature that he actually etched using a little diamond tip in the window of his study where he wrote many of his great works. And I just loved that. Now, I know it's only a signature, but to me, that is a piece of Burns. You know, it's an artifact, of course. And it just, I loved it. And my friend Ewan and I stood there for about 15 minutes just thinking, he actually wrote this. He actually did that. You know, always, 300 years ago, that was Robert Burns who actually scribed that in the window. So if you ever get a chance to go to Dumfries, it's not a place that's on many tourist maps. You can go to the church there. You can see his memorial. It's a bit odd. It's a bit rude because it's like a lot of churches at that time. The gravestones are huge and vulgar and over the top. And they've also given a lot of his contemporaries what they call blue plaques in the United Kingdom, where they say X lived here between, and it was all part of the sort of the Burns house culture, the pub that Burns lived in. I'm not sure many of them were great. Certainly not in Burns's terms, but nevertheless, I mean, they're trying to bring tourists to the area, of course. But it's a bit vulgar. But even that vulgarity, I think, is quite interesting. But I'll come back to that later on. So I wondered what poem to play you by way of celebrating Burns Day. Now, this is one that, and I'll explain it afterwards in terms of what I think it means. Now, it can mean different things to different people, which is another thing that's interesting about storytelling, isn't it? But this particular piece is To a Moose, and I've got a version here that I discovered yesterday when I was researching for the show by a national treasure of Scotland, the one and only Sir Billy Connelly. So this is Robert Burns' To a Moose.
To a mouse, on turning her up in her nest with the plough, November 1785. Wee sleekit coorin' timorous beastie over a panics in thy breastie. The needna start a war sae hasty wi' bicker and brattle. I would be laith to rin and chase thee wi' murdering pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt na whiles but thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou mun live. A dame and icker in a thrave's a sma request. I'll get a blessing with a lave and never missed. Thy wee bit hussy too in ruin. It's silly was the winds are strewin', and naething now to big a new un of foggage green, and bleak December winds ensuing, baith snell and keen. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cruel coulter passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee money a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but hoose are hauled to thole the winter's sleety dribble and cranach called. But Moosey, thou art no thy lane, and proven foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after glee, and lees nowt but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared wi' me. The present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward, though I cannae see, I guess and fear.
No, I can't help but smile. It also makes me feel quite emotional for some reason. I don't know why, but it does. So what do you think that's about? Now, if you want to take part, please drop a note in the chat. And if you're tuning in from somewhere exotic like Scotland or Canada or America, wherever you are, please let me know where you are and I'll give you a name check on the show. But what's that about? Well, you might not know this, but Burns was actually in his 20s. He was a very poor man. He was actually poor all his life. And he just outside the museum in Dumfries, there's actually this picture here. And Burns was a farmer for much of his life. There are some developments later, which I'll come on to in a few minutes, that are not so well known publicly. But the actual poem To a Mouse is actually about Burns feeling sad because one day when he was out with this plough that you can see here, he was ploughing. What else would you do with a plough, Scott? What a silly thing to say. Anyway, he was working the land with this plough, and he actually managed to kill a little field mouse. Now, in the poem, and I don't have time today to go through the Scots and translate it, and to be honest, it's not my speciality either, because contrary to what you think, most Scots don't speak Scots, at least don't speak Scots like Burns wrote, very different to how we speak today. But in this poem, he basically says, I'm sorry to the moose. You know, he says, I'm sorry, I did that. I really didn't mean it. And then he reflects, and this is where there is a bit of a circular story today, because one of the things that folk don't know about Burns was he cared about the environment. He didn't always care about people, but he cared about the environment. And he reflects on that, and he talks about nature, and he reflects in a sad way about the fate of every creature, including himself, during their lives. And the poem goes on to talk about things about, you know, futility of planning. What's the point of trying to do anything in an uncertain world? He talks about the present quite a lot and how the mouse is lucky because the mouse lives in the present. He talks about how difficult it is to be poor in Scotland and how there is injustice all over the world when people have so little. And then finally, he talks about the sort of the human duty to understand all of life. And it doesn't matter how significant that life might be, he thinks we should all think about it and understand it and really appreciate it. Now, quite often with Burns, that's not fully appreciated, that he was actually very philosophical. And as with a lot of stories, particularly from from ancient times, if you like, you have to translate them. And this is why I've got my my Rosetta Stone here. You know, you have to sometimes spend time with these poems or these stories, any story, not just the Scottish ones, any story, to actually get to what the author was talking about. And I particularly like this one because it sounds trivial, doesn't it, to a mouse? But it really wasn't a trivial piece. It was about poverty. It was about futility of life and how difficult it was at that time. But it was also about hope and about how maybe we can change the world. And if you tune in regularly, you'll know that I believe that stories can change the world. That's my favourite Burns poem in terms of the short ones. I love Tam O'Shanter, but it would take me about 3 days to go through that and really unweave all the meaning within it. I say I'm not an academic, but nevertheless, I mean, these are poems that we studied at school. And it meant a lot to me. Not at school. I thought it was awful at school. I'm not going to tell you any lies. It just meant nothing to me at school. It was actually boring and tedious. It was like Shakespeare. We didn't enjoy it. But as you get into your 20s and your 30s and beyond, these things begin to, the veil is definitely taken away and you start to understand them much, much better. So if you get a chance, if you live in Scotland or you're visiting Scotland, I would recommend going to Dumfries and visiting the church where the memorial is, and he's actually buried there. He was moved there. He was only 37, but also to the little museum. And the fella, I think his name was Peter, who runs the museum, was absolutely lovely. And my friend Ewan and I walked in and we got the whole place to ourselves. But I will never forget that writing on the wall. It was absolutely gorgeous. And I thought it was like having the man in the room. You know, it really was. It was quite it was quite emotional for me. But so that there is your Robert Burns story. So please, if you have any thoughts on Burns or you have any experience of Burns, please let me know, because I personally think he's quite inspirational and not as trivial as many people think he is. So the next thing I'm going to, I called this the Grime and Glory of Scotland. And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to look back on this several times in this hour or so, because a lot of the time we get an idealistic perspective of our countries, of our organisations, and even of ourselves in the stories we tell ourselves. And I mean, Scotland often laughs at itself. And one of the sort of the classics, I've got a wee picture of this as well somewhere. Where is it? Oh, I don't see it. Hold on, I know what it is. Hold on, let me just get it, because it's quite nice. When I was away, I was in a caravan with my friend Ewan, and in the morning we had breakfast together, and we decided that it's not uploading, doesn't matter. We decided that actually I will get it because it's quite nice. Let me just do this. So we decided that we would go very Scottish on this little trip, and we would have all sorts of things Scottish. And what we would do is, well, what we did was we went to one of the local supermarkets and we bought Iron Brew, which, if you've never heard of it, is a disgusting sweet drink that Scots love. It's I think there's only 3 countries in the world where Coke is not the #1 fizzy drink seller. In Scotland, it's this thing called Iron Brew. I think the stuff's disgusting. I used to drink it when I was a kid, though. I loved it. But on the other side of it, and there are walls in the supermarket. This was in Dumfries or Dunfermline. I can't remember. It was in one of the border, near the borders, in the supermarkets. There was literally a wall of Iron Brew. On the right is a bit of I know it's a bit of a stereotype, but to be honest, you and I had this in the morning. You've got 2 things there. You've got haggis at the top, and you've got square sausage on the right. Now that's very Scottish, but that's the sort of thing. It's a good thing and it's interesting. But it's also part of the problem with Scotland, because, or not the problem, the challenge with Scotland, because Scotland is a bit stuck in its storytelling. And I'll explain why as we move into this and introduce some characters that I think are quite important, but are nevertheless not well known in Scotland, which I think is quite odd. But let me give you an opportunity to hear a story about something that I believe should be much better known. And this part of the show is all about what are my favourite stories. So this is one that I became aware of probably about 10 years ago, maybe. And the story is actually about a tree. And the tree is called the Fortingall Yew. Now, I've got a little poem here, and there's a picture next to it. But I'll tell you about the tree before I actually show you this, because this is a tree in a churchyard in just sort of in Perthshire. It's a beautiful little valley. It's quite hard to get to. There's a single track road, and it takes some getting to. Even from nearby, it's still quite a windy road. But eventually get to this place called Fortingall. And in the churchyard, there is a tree. Now, it's not the whole tree. It's still quite a nice thing. It's quite a big thing, but it's not the original tree, because this tree, myths at least tell us, is the oldest living thing in Europe. Some say it's 9,000 years old. And I love that, because even if that's not true, it's probably near 3,000 to 5,000 years old. They've tried to age it, but I like the 9,000, so I'm sticking with it for today. I'm not being a scientist today. I like this myth. And the part of the story that I really love is the story goes that Pontius Pilate's father was actually stationed in Fortingall, and that Pontius Pilate was actually born underneath the Fortingall Yew. Now, I just love that. I don't think it's true, but I love it because it's technically possible, but realistically, I don't think it is true. But nevertheless, I love that story. But the thing I like about the Fortingall Yew, and the thing I like about trees generally in terms of stories, is that they have these very long lifespans. So this tree has seen everything from the Bronze Age through to the Industrial Age, through to before that, the clan warfare all over Scotland, and the peaceful times and the not so peaceful times, the Roman invasion, obviously, etc., etc. And I love that. You're looking at something that is so old and so wise. And I know I'm into the world of myth, but what's wrong with that? That it takes you back. I mean, not in a sort of terrible Hollywood type of way, like some of these awful films about Scotland that you've no doubt seen in some of the TV shows, but in a real way. That tree, or part of that tree, or a historical part of that tree was there when we couldn't read and write. It was there when humans were wildlife. We've only been humans for 500 generations. We're 50,000 generations as wildlife. So it's a beautiful thing. And I sat there the day I went. I sat there, I think it was for about 2 hours, just looking at it. And it's behind a little stone wall, or as we say in Scotland, a stone dyke. And it's just a beautiful thing. So again, if you ever get the chance to go and see a real story in Scotland, get yourself to the Fortingall U, because it's something really, really special. But let me add to that, because there's another poet. Now, I did say that there was things that I'm not so happy about. There's another poet from Scotland called Hugh Mcdermott. And Hugh Mcdermott is, for me, the greatest Scottish poet. He's not by no way means is he the most famous Scottish poet, but nevertheless, I think he's the greatest Scottish poet. And he was actually a very complex man and quite difficult to understand. Some of his poetry is extremely difficult to understand. And I'll talk about one of those when I finish playing this. But this is a poem that he wrote about Scotland. And I thought it was appropriate because it's a poem about some of the things that tree has witnessed over its 9,000 years. So this is Scotland by Hugh Mcdermott. It requires great love of it deeply to read the configuration of a land, gradually grow conscious of fine shadings, of great meanings in slight symbols. Hear at last the great voice that speaks softly. See the swell and fall upon the flank of a statue carved out in a whole country's marble. Be like spring, like a hand in a window, moving new and old things carefully to and fro, moving a fraction of flower here, placing an inch of air there, and without breaking anything, so I have gathered unto myself all the loose ends of Scotland, and by naming them and accepting them, loving them and identifying myself with them, attempt to express the whole. Isn't that wonderful? And he was the type of poet that, that was done at the beginning of the last century and moving through into the middle of the century. He was a bit like, for me, he was like Scotland's beat poet. So I see him as a contemporary of Kerouac, Ginsberg, etc. And some of his poetry, like A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, I'll show you, there's a nice illustration here. There we go. It's not uploading, never mind. But he was the type of character. I'll get it to come on here. There you go. No, it won't. There's something. I noticed the chat's not working very well either today. We're having gremlins on Restream. But this is a picture of him in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, and it was done in 1954. And one of his poems is called A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. It's a very difficult piece of poetry to read about, but a bit like Burns, it was about the life of working class Scot, and I remember studying it. I got in my first job after I gave up my scientific career. I moved into working for one of the big companies in Edinburgh, a utility company, British Gas, and one of the guys there was a guy called Alan. And Alan was an older fella, and I very, very quickly realised that he was very wise. And not only did he teach me about the pleasures of proper coffee, but he introduced me to On the Road, Kerouac's classic piece. And then he told me about this Scottish beat poet who was called Hugh Mcdermott. And since then, I've been a student of Mcdermott, and he was one of the founders of the Scottish National Party, etc. He wrote his own version of Scots because he was frustrated by the Scottish culture not supporting true Scots. So he made his own language up. He was a real firebrand of a man. And if you go to where he lived, there's a place in the Borders called Langham. There's a beautiful statue there. Well, it's not a statue. It's a sort of a mosaic made of metal. It's quite an unusual thing. But nevertheless, Mcdermott's work, and The Drunk Man Looks at This, I reckon it took me a year to read that. And I read a lot, but I had to really work it out. Unfortunately, these days you can get books. I don't know where my copy is. Is it? Oh, I should have had it to show you it, but I don't know where it's gone. It's usually there. Anyway, it's got on one page, it's got the Scots, well, the Mcdermott Scots, and then the other page, it's got the English. And it is about, as I said earlier, a bit like the Burns story. It's about what it's like to be a Scot living in the 1940s, 1950s in Scotland, and the tyranny of England as he saw it, the tyranny of people not being interested in what's happening, the tyranny of people not telling stories, the tyranny of the sort of the shortbread tin culture that Scotland has often and is often criticised for. If you don't know what that means, I'll come back to that at the end of the show, because I think it's quite an important theme to come back to. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you're interested in the Fortingall U, because it's so excellent. You know, it's such a cool thing to see, and I just love the fact that there are stories behind it. So please remember, this is Artefact Live with me, your host, Scott MacArthur, where we look at the art and science of storytelling. If you're interested in joining me on the show, or have any comments on the show, or even better, just telling me, you know, what you thought about what I was speaking about, please email me at scott@sculptureconsulting.com, and I'll just stick that on the page for you while I talk about the next little bit. So that's my email address there. Incidentally, my company's called Sculpture because I think that stories can sculpt the culture of organizations and of individuals. It can sculpt a person's life. It's a really important part of that little couplet that I always use, that, you know, facts tell, but it's stories that sell. It's stories that make things happen. You need the facts, absolutely, but it's the stories that make things happen. So what next? I'm going to move on to my artifact, and this is quite interesting because this is the largest ever artifact we've had on the show.
It was my favorite thing in the entire world.
So my artifact, I've just seen that my friend Ewan has joined me. Hello, Ewan. Thanks for tuning in. I've just said it's the largest artifact I've ever had on the show, and it is, because it's a mountain. And this mountain is called Shahalian, and it's just on the southern edges of the Highlands, on the famous A9 road as you go north to Inverness and the rest of the Highlands. And I discovered this. How can you discover something so large? But I discovered this mountain purely by accident about a long time ago, when I went walking with my friend, very, very good friend, who lives up in Scotland, called Brian Gordon. Hello, Brian, if you're watching. And we literally stumbled across this. So it wasn't by design. I didn't know anything about it. But the artifact that I'd like to introduce you to today is a place called Shahalian. This is Shahalian. Now, Shahalian is an absolutely gorgeous mountain, and it's one of the mountains in Scotland that's above 3,000 feet, and they are known as Munros. Now, Munros have become part of the Scottish culture. There are crazy people who go Munro bagging, they call it. You know, they try and walk all the different Munros all over Scotland, and they make a hobby of it. Well, that's good for them. I'm not into that sort of, you know, running fast to get through all the different Munros. I like to enjoy the Munros as I experience them. I think I've done about 40 or 50 of them. I'm nowhere near, having walked all the Munros. But there's a great book, this book. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen it before. A guy called Cameron McNeish. And in his book here, he talks about Shahalian. Let me just give you a very brief part of this. I'm only going to read a sentence of it. I was walking the hills with Hamish Brown a few days ago, and he commented that he wished people would begin to act a bit more like goats than sheep. This was on Shahalian. He was criticising the fact that everyone tended to climb hills by the same route, rather than to discover their own way to the summits. And this book is full of little bits of wisdom like that. And that's inspired me to actually write something myself about Shahalian. And I didn't know this. I'm not going to tell you fibs. I didn't know this. There's something special about Shahalian that brings together two of my great loves, and that is folklore and science. And that's not something you often hear about in the same sentence. This is a poem that I wrote, and this is me reading it, about Shahalian. And this did quite well. I got into one Scottish Poetry Award thing with this. Didn't win it, but I was so chuffed. But this is my poem called Become Shahalian. Rhythm here, I feel connected to the mountains, curlew and sheep. The wind swirling down the glen whispers the wisdom of the Caledonian fairy folk. The cave, set and warren flow seamlessly with the burns and rivers into Loch Tummel. There's a path all the way to the top which feels out of place. Our buildings, roads and art often appear so unnatural, even as they spring from our animal minds. Then the cairn. I didn't think of pilgrims or badgers, rather a favourite story of dragons coming here to die, leaving behind the stones round and smooth from the workings of their blazing stomachs. I sit beside the dragon and look down on the glistening yellow and purple scene. Time no longer seems important, and the weight of the world eases from my shoulders. All I can hear is my breath in the wind. I close my eyes and become Shahalian. Now, oh God, I've heard myself read that for ages. Quite nice. I think it makes me emotional because of the Scottish thing. But the thing that's amazing about Shahalian, I better move on because I'm going to cry. The thing that's amazing about Shahalian is, and this is something that people don't know so much, you'll hear the words in there, the weight of the world comes away from my shoulders. That was a reference to the work of Charles Mason, who actually measured the weight of the earth at Shahalian. In the photographs that I've shown you, that it looks like quite a standard structure. Shahalian, it's like a triangle. You know, it looks like a cone, if you like. And he used it along with mathematician Charles Hutton to devise a method of weighing the earth. So Shahalian, that beautiful mountain there, was the place where they first measured the weight of the earth in the world. And it was actually pretty accurate. So it's actually, the maths is quite cool, because it was, they got it within, a reasonable degree of error. So it was also, quite important. But nevertheless, I love it. The other thing I like about it, and one of the stories, those of you who read Ian Banks will know that I gently stole one of his stories, where the story goes that when dinosaurs went to die, they went to the top of mountains in Scotland. And when they died, all that was left was the stones that were in their tummy, and that's the cairn that you see at the top of most mountains in Scotland. I love that. And I remember when I read that, it was in his book, The Crow Road, Ian Banks' book, The Crow Road. And I really loved it. And I tell my kids that story, and I embellish it and add to it, etc. But that was a reference to Ian Banks. So that, to me, is the artefact that means anything more to me than most things on the whole planet. It really does. And it's something that I just love, the fact that it brings the people talk in the scientific domain about magisteria. Well, it brings the magisteria of storytelling, myth making to the scientific domain. And I just absolutely love that. Just one last look at Shahalian. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? Now, I noticed there's a few of you tuning in from overseas, in particular from Canada and the United States. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. I need to tell you something, though, and it's something that I did hint at the beginning, that the reality of Scotland is not always as it's portrayed in its current image. There's also some surprising things. The first thing, I'll tell a little, very short story, but nevertheless an important one. I used to work in a university in Scotland, and I had a really tedious job. I was the HR director. But I used to get to know a lot of the academics, and one or two of them were of particular interest to me. A couple of them were absolutely brilliant. There was, one of the best physicists in the world was there. There was another lady who, Howie Firth was his name, an amazing man. I had dinner with Howie Firth, Patrick Moore, and Buzz Aldrin one night in a hotel in Orkney. That's another story I'll have to tell you sometime. But one of the ladies, who was a terrific teacher, she was a Scottish culture expert. And I was having a drink with her one night. There was a pub in the little town called Elgin where we lived, where one of the campuses were, called the Thunderton. And we were in there talking about her work. And I was obviously beguiled by it. She was a beguiling storyteller, so I was in there. I really enjoyed her company. And she was telling me about Scottish country dancing. Now, I have no interest at all in Scottish country dancing, right? It is not something that, very few Scots are interested in it. It's a bit of a thing for certain types of people in Scotland. But nevertheless, it's part of the culture, it's part of the history. But I said to her, where do you do your research? How do you study it? She said, I go to Canada every year. And I was like, what? Go to Canada every year? Yeah, go to Canada every year. Why is that? I said, well, actually, when you think about it, it's pretty obvious. In Canada, Scottish country dancing that they have is as it was at the time of the Highland clearances. When people got moved out of Scotland, the Highland clearances is another story, I'll tell you something, but it's basically when people were moved out of Scotland for a number of reasons, but mainly for money, so they could put sheep on the land rather than have people farming on the land. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's part of the story. And they moved them across to America and to Canada and to Australia. But the Scots continued some of their culture, and the Scottish country dancing in Canada and in America is actually more authentic than the Scottish country dancing that happens in Scotland. And that's because in Scotland it evolved. Whereas in Canada and America, it didn't. It stayed as it was because that was their culture. They kept it as it was to celebrate it. I had no idea. So, like a lot of things, even when you talk to Scottish people about some of these things, they think, "Oh, it's traditional in Scotland." It really isn't. It's developed from the tradition. But if you want to look back in time, go to America, go to Canada, go to some parts of Australia, to India, even, and you'll see some of the original culture overseas because of that in another part of Scottish history. So I think that again is rather exciting, and it's something that I think we need to think about more in Scotland. It's not. I'm not talking about not lacking. I don't want us to stop progressing. I don't want us to stop developing our culture. I'm going to come back to that at the end. But nevertheless, where it all started from, we're so lucky that as a consequence of something terrible, we can look back and actually see what it looked like. That's pretty unique in global culture. I think it's quite powerful. I'm going to introduce you to someone now. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. The LinkedIn questions are not coming onto the chat for some reason, so I will look at it when I'm playing this next piece. This next piece, and it's my second to last thing, and it's a piece that I pulled together for International Women's Day last year. I was speaking at a conference, and you'll see it's with a lesser quality camera than I have now, but nevertheless, the story is pretty good. Now, this is all about a woman who, again, I think should be not only famous in Scotland, but famous, everywhere. And her name is beginning, a bit like John Muir is in America, her name is beginning to come through in some of the cultures across the world. In Scotland, she even features on the money. Her name is Nan Shepherd. And I think she's just amazing. And it really dovetails beautifully with the piece that I played you about Burns. Now, let me play you this little extract from my own show. It's only about 5 minutes, but this is an introduction to Nan Shepherd. And this is a woman that I think should be extremely famous, and she just isn't. She's a Scottish woman. Her name is Nan Shepherd. Nan Shepherd. And Nan, she found her bliss. She found what she believed in. And what she believed in was Cairngorm. And Cairngorm, you probably heard it called the Cairngorm Mountains, but it's actually meant to be Cairngorm. I used to live like 100 miles north of Cairngorm. My brother lives very near there at the moment, and it's up in the north of Scotland near Aviemore. And the Bank of Scotland, or the Royal Bank of Scotland, I can't remember which one it is, you'll see it in a minute, have got Nan on the £5 note in Scotland. And they made this little video, and I think it's magic. Can't believe it, but I think it's really good. So let me just play this as well before we get on to our final guest.
Let me take you on a journey inspired by Scotland, its nature, its landscape, and its people. A journey with a value all its own in every sense. The creative journey behind the Royal Bank of Scotland's new £5 note. The journey starts with Nan Shepherd, Highland poet, writer, and wanderer. For Nan, Scotland's wilds were home from home. Walks through her beloved Cairngorms in all weathers were her inspiration. So, it's Nan against a mountain backdrop that takes pride of place on the front of the note. Nan Shepherd's journeys saw her form a bond with the nature of Scotland. The ebb and flow of the seasons brought her stories and poems to life, just as it brings life to our shores, rivers and lochs, and the communities that depend on them. We celebrate that bond through the mackerel and herringbone pattern on the reverse of the note. Present too is verse in Gaelic, by Scottish poet Sorley Maclean.
Choisich mi cúide dí mo huicsha, amui di tuva choin.
While on the front we have verse from Nan herself. But the struggle between frost and the force in running water is not quickly over. The battle fluctuates, and at the point of fluctuation between the motion in water and the immobility of frost, strange and beautiful forms are evolved. So we near the end of this journey. Although for Nan Shepherd, a beginning and end mattered not. For her, walking the hills was about the journey for its own sake. To be free, like the woad blowing in the wind. It was a joy that even clouds of the Scottish midgie couldn't spoil. So it is that the woad, its natural blue colour reflected in the blue of the note, earns its place on the new £5. And yes, even the wee midgie makes an appearance too. Yet it's only right that the last word has to go to Nan Shepherd. It's a word on freedom, in the form of one of her most famous quotes, there on the front of the note. It is a grand thing to get leave to live. We couldn't have put it better, Nan, for this new £5 note is a grand thing indeed.
Now, the reason that I chose to include Nan, one is I think she should be much, much better known. The theme of, finding what you love, it seems to be a key theme. And Nan Shepherd was inspired by a mountain, effectively, and she spent her whole life there studying it. She was an academic as well as a poet, and she wrote just a couple of beautiful books. But I highly recommend it because it gives you, I think, a sense of perspective that I know I've fallen into the trap of trying to, I mean, I've had a few jobs, I've worked in a few sectors, and I've, seen a bit of the world. But going that way is great. It gives you perspective. But going this way can be very, very beautiful. And oftentimes the most important things are right in front of you. And that's exactly what Nan did. And I love the little reference, and well done, the Royal Bank, to the midgie. Forgive me if I'm being a bit Scottish, but the midgie is very rarely given any credit in Scotland. So I quite like that. That made me smile. So that was me talking about the wonderful Nan Shepherd. Now, unfortunately, the chat's not working, so I can't see what people are saying to me here. But let me just give you a little bit of background. Nan was an incredible person. She died in 1981, and I think, now you may have heard of Rachel Carson, who wrote a very famous book called the Silent Spring, which is seen by many as the book that launched the environmental movement. Well, Nan was Scotland's Rachel Carson. She was absolutely in love with nature and with the outside and with the animals and the mountains, and the Living Mountain book, which is a very short book, much shorter than, Silent Spring's quite short, but it's quite a short book, The Living Mountain. It's gorgeous. And she makes the mundane really come alive. She makes the awesome understandable. I think she's just a wonderful writer. And I often read her in the summer, because it just reminds me of all these adventures that I've had in Scotland and the early part of my life, and also it reminds me of the importance of nature and how important it is to the Scottish psyche. And of course, once again, that word freedom comes into her work, and it seems to be something that's been embedded in the Scots psyche for hundreds of years. And it's something that some of the best poetry and some of the best art has come from that whole concept of freedom. I might do that as another show, actually, because there's a whole topic there that we can explore. But I'd like to end today's show, and I say I'm over 45 back. I can't keep it to 45 minutes. I should just tell people it's an hour long, shouldn't I? But I'd like to end with another Scot that, again, I don't think is as well known as he should be. But to introduce him, I'm going to go to another Scot, as I've done earlier, and I'm going to play a piece of music. Now, I know my friend Andy's watching. Andy, you'll know exactly what I'm going to do here. This is Lorraine Mcintosh. Now, she is in quite a famous Scottish pop group from the 1980s and 90s called Deacon Blue. But this was her singing a particular piece by this poet that I'll talk about after I've played it to you. So I really hope you enjoy this. I think this should be the national anthem. That's how much I like this.
Rock the wind in the clear day dawning, blows the cloots, he'll stir gaudy Ireland day. But there's mere not a rock wind blowing through the great glen on the worldland day. It's a folk that would gather rottens, that gang gallus fresh and gay, tack the road and seek other lonans, fae the real place to sport and play.
I hope you enjoyed that. It might not have been that you understood it, but it's something that I love, this particular piece of poetry, and I love that they made it into a song. And it's actually by a lovely fella called Hamish Henderson, who's a poet that, you know, they have made movies about him. He is part of the Scottish culture, but he's nothing like as well known as Burns or even Mcdermott, I would say. And this particular poem is called Freedom come all ye. And it's a lovely piece of commentary, as well as the actual structure of it is wonderful as well. But it's basically about, again, a bit like Burns. I said I would come back to that. It's a bit like Burns. It's about the sort of socialist movement in Scotland. It's about the anti-imperialist perspective, from the Scottish perspective. And it talks about how the Scots went to war despite not wanting to go to war. Now, I'm not sure I believe that that's why Scots went to war in 200 years ago, but nevertheless, it kind of completes the circle for me, for some of the cultural aspects that are in the Scottish psyche that I think we need to think more about. And I think that, to me, is where I'm going to begin to bring this to a close, because I think that my own country, and I love it, you probably saw earlier how much I love it, but I think it's stuck in a rut. I don't think, for example, Scotland has as rich, if not a more rich, folklore tradition than Ireland does. But the Irish are steeped in that culture. The Scots aren't. If you say to a Scottish child about red caps or, some of the classic Scottish myths, there's a good book here, I'll show you. This one. Really super book. I've got 3 or 4 copies of this that I keep buying it when I'm on holiday in Scotland. It's a lovely book, and it's all about the sort of the fairies and the folklore in Scotland. If you say to kids, tell me a story about a Scottish story, they'll tell you about the Loch Ness monster. How boring. It's reasonably interesting if you're from abroad, but not if you're a Scot. They won't talk about the classics. It's not embedded in our culture. And indeed, a lot of Scots think that Braveheart was kind of accurate. It just wasn't. And there's another friend of mine right now, he's just finished it, Max. Hello, Max, if you're there. Max has been studying Bannockburn, and the realities are so different to what we get taught in our schools. And I think this is really important, because, as I've said all along the 60 shows that I've done, I believe that stories can change the world, but I also think the stories can reflect the world. Hence why, when I started, I told you about my experience with my friend Andy about the Glasgow Apollo. You suddenly realise just how important these stories are to the culture of a country, of a business, and to your own personal being, you as an individual. And that's why I called my poem "Become Shahalian," because I was thinking about how do I become the mixture of all these different things. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. And I see there's been loads of you trying to comment and I haven't read them out. It's terrible, but I'll just give a few of you a little mention. Simone Joe Moore, thanks. Simone's commenting about the fact that the English subtitles in LinkedIn are hilarious. I bet they are. James Kunkel, thank you very much for tuning in, James, and I love your feedback. Thanks for saying it was excellent. Scott Johnson, how you doing, Scott? Our escaped lawyer friend. Scott is a frequent tuner runner to our Apollo show as well, which is great to see. And then my friend Ewan, I mentioned earlier, he's of course tuned in. And then finally, Gail Robertson. Gail and I met online a while ago now, Gail, I think, and it was the Scottish thing that brought us together. And thank you very much for all these questions and observations you've made, Gail. And I do hope you get to Scotland one day and maybe we can share a wee glass of Iron Brew and a big glass of whiskey. Remember, there's no E in whiskey. So I hope you've enjoyed today's show. It's off at a tangent a little bit, but nevertheless, I hope it demonstrates to you just how important it is to go through your life thinking about stories, because a bit like Nan Shepherd, although she's not famous, certainly not as famous as she should be, she was one of the people who started to change the world's perspective on nature and the environment. You really can change the world. And by telling your stories, by really getting to underneath them, and it doesn't need to be, all of them don't need to be your stories. I mean, I talk about being an archaeologist of your own life, and I think that's important. But even telling other people's stories, like I've told you today, Nan Shepherd's story, Henderson's story, a little bit about Burns, a little bit about Mcdermott, that these stories can really act as an empathy engine. In other words, they help you understand different perspectives. They help you get into the shoes of the other people from across the world with different perspectives. And by goodness, do we need more of that today. So thank you very much for tuning in to Artefact Live, where we talk about the art and science of storytelling. My name is Scott MacArthur, and I hope we'll see you next week at the same time, 12:30 UK time on Tuesdays across the different platforms. I'll see you soon.